In 1845, a fungus appeared in the potato fields of Ireland. Within weeks, the crop was rotting. Within months, the primary food source for millions was gone. By 1852, over 1 million people had starved to death. Another million had fled the island. The population of Ireland, which had been over 8 million, would never recover. It remains smaller today than it was before the famine. But Ireland was not poor. It was part of the United Kingdom, the wealthiest empire on earth. And throughout the famine, Ireland exported food: grain, beef, pork, butter, eggs. All of it shipped to England while the Irish starved. The ports were guarded by British soldiers to prevent the starving from seizing the food being taken from their country. This was not a natural disaster. This was policy. It was profitable. Famines are almost never about the absence of food. They're about the distribution of food, about who controls it, who profits from it, and who is allowed to starve. History is full of famines that occurred while granaries were full, while food was being exported, while merchants grew rich. The dead were not victims of scarcity. They were victims of markets. The Irish famine is the clearest case, but it is not unique. The British Empire engineered or exacerbated famines in India repeatedly across the 19th and early 20th centuries. Millions died while food was shipped out to maintain prices, feed troops, or stock markets in London. The Ottoman Empire allowed famine in Mount Lebanon during World War I, while diverting food to the military. The Soviet Union starved Ukraine in the 1930s while exporting grain to finance industrialization. In every case, people died not because food did not exist, but because the system required their death. Let's go back to Ireland. By the 1840s, the Irish population was over 8 million, most of them peasants living on tiny plots of rented land. They grew potatoes because potatoes yielded more calories per acre than any other crop. A family could survive on an acre of potatoes. They could not survive on the money they earned. Most of the land was owned by absentee English landlords who extracted rent and exported whatever else the land produced. The peasants ate potatoes. Everything else, wheat, oats, cattle, pigs, was sold abroad. When the blight hit in 1845, the potato crop failed. The peasants had nothing to eat, but the other crops did not fail. Wheat and oats were harvested normally. Livestock was healthy. Ireland produced enough food to feed its population several times over. The problem was that the food belonged to landlords and merchants, and they were not going to give it away. The British government, under Prime Minister Robert Peel, initially imported maize from America to provide relief. But Peel's government fell in 1846, and the new administration, led by Lord John Russell, refused further aid. Russell was a devotee of laissez-faire economics. He believed that market forces should determine food distribution. Government interference, he argued, would distort prices and create dependency. So the government did nothing. The market was left to solve the problem. But markets do not feed people who have no money. The Irish peasants could not afford the grain being shipped out of their own country. Prices were set by demand in England, where consumers had money. The starving Irish had none, so the food left. Ships loaded with grain, cattle, and pork sailed from Irish ports under military guard, while people died on the roadside. This was not incompetence. It was logic. The landlords and merchants who controlled the food were profit maximizing. Selling to England was more profitable than selling locally. The British government, despite its rhetoric about relief, prioritized property rights and market efficiency over human life. The system worked exactly as designed. The Irish starved, the landlords profited, and the empire continued. By 1847, the famine was catastrophic. Mass graves were dug. Entire villages were abandoned. Fever and disease followed starvation. The British government eventually established workhouses where the starving could labor in exchange for meager rations. But the workhouses were deliberately harsh, designed to discourage dependency. People who entered often died from overwork, malnutrition, or disease. It was relief in name only. Meanwhile, evictions accelerated. Landlords, unable to collect rent from starving tenants, cleared their estates. Families were thrown out of their homes. Cottages were burned to prevent reoccupancy. Thousands were left homeless in the middle of winter. The logic was economic. Empty land could be consolidated into larger, more profitable farms. The peasants were simply in the way. The famine ended not because food returned, but because the population had collapsed. By 1852, enough people had died or emigrated that the survivors could subsist on what remained. The crisis resolved itself through depopulation. In Ireland, once one of the most densely populated regions in Europe, became a land of empty fields and ruined villages. But the famine was not an economic disaster for everyone. Landlords who consolidated estates emerged wealthier. Merchants who exported food made fortunes. British industries gained a flood of cheap labor as Irish emigrants poured into Liverpool, Manchester, and Glasgow. The famine redistributed resources upward. The poor died, the rich profited, and the system called it market efficiency. Now move east to India. The British Raj experienced repeated famines throughout its rule, but the most deadly were in the late 19th century. The famine of 1876 to 1878 killed between 5 and 10 million people. The famine of 1896 to 1902 killed another 6 to 10 million. These were not isolated crop failures. They were systemic collapses engineered engineered by colonial policy. India, like Ireland, was exporting food during its famines. The British colonial administration prioritized revenue collection and trade over feeding the population. When droughts reduced harvests, the government did not suspend taxes or ban exports. It did the opposite. Tax collection continued. Grain was shipped to England. Prices were allowed to rise unchecked, putting food out of reach for millions. The viceroy, during the 1876 famine, Lord Lytton, held a grand durbar in Delhi to proclaim Queen Victoria Empress of India. The event cost a fortune and involved lavish feasts while millions starved. Lytton explicitly opposed famine relief, arguing that it would create dependency and undermine Indian self-reliance. His policies were praised in London as fiscally responsible. British administrators tracked grain prices obsessively. It's not to lower them, but to prevent them from falling. If prices dropped, it meant supply was abundant, which would reduce export revenues. So grain was stockpiled or shipped abroad to maintain high prices. The policy was called minimizing market distortion. In practice, it meant ensuring that the starving could not afford food. The railways, built by the British to extract resources, made the famines worse. In previous centuries, regional famines had been localized. A drought in one province did not affect another, but the railways connected all of India to the ports. When famine struck, grain was not redistributed to the affected regions. It was transported to Bombay and Calcutta and loaded onto ships bound for England. The infrastructure designed to modernize India became the mechanism of mass death. British officials defended this by arguing that free trade and private property were sacred principles. Interfering with markets, even to prevent mass starvation, would undermine the empire's credibility. Better to let millions die than to compromise on ideology. And so they did. The death toll in India across the late 19th and early 20th centuries is difficult to calculate. Estimates range from 12 to 29 million, possibly more. These were not deaths from unavoidable scarcity. They were deaths from policy. The British Empire extracted wealth from India at the cost of tens of millions of lives, and it called it civilization. Now consider the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Stalin's regime collectivized agriculture, seizing land from peasants and consolidating it into state farms. The goal was to industrialize rapidly, which required exporting grain to buy machinery. Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, was the primary target. Peasants resisted collectivization. Stalin responded with force. In 1932 and 1933, the Soviet government imposed grain quotas so high that they were impossible to meet. When peasants failed to deliver, their remaining food was confiscated. Soldiers swept through villages, seizing grain, potatoes, livestock, even seeds for the next planting. The peasants were left with nothing. Famine followed. The Holodomor, as it is known in Ukraine, killed between 3 and 5 million people. Some estimates go higher. Villages were cordoned off. Roads were blocked. Peasants trying to flee to cities were turned back. The famine was not a side effect of collectivization. It was a tool. Stalin used starvation to break resistance and assert control. And throughout the famine, the Soviet Union continued exporting grain. Ships loaded with Ukrainian wheat sailed to Western Europe. The grain was sold for hard currency, which was used to purchase industrial equipment. The famine was profitable, not for the Soviet people, but for the industrialization campaign. Stalin prioritized factories over food. The dead were simply a cost of modernization. This pattern repeats across continents and centuries. The Bengal famine of 1943 during World War II killed between 2 and 3 million people. Bengal was still producing food, but the British colonial administration diverted supplies to the military and 2 regions considered strategically important. Churchill refused to divert ships to bring grain to Bengal, stating that the famine was the fault of Indians for breeding like rabbits. The market, the war, and imperial priorities all mattered more than Bengali lives. Ethiopia in the 1980s experienced famine under the Derg regime. The government used food as a weapon, withholding it from regions controlled by rebel groups. International aid was diverted or blocked. People starved not because of drought alone, but because the regime prioritized military victory over civilian survival. Somalia in the 1990s saw a famine amid civil war. Warlords controlled food supplies, using starvation as a tactic. International aid was stolen and sold. The food existed, but the armed groups who controlled it profited more from scarcity than abundance. The famine persisted not because resources were insufficient, but because chaos was more profitable than order. The pattern is universal. Famines occur when political and economic systems prioritize profit, control, or ideology over human survival. Food becomes a commodity, and commodities flow to those who can pay. The poor who cannot pay starve. And the system classifies this as natural, inevitable, the result of market forces or unfortunate circumstances. But it is not natural. It is designed. Every famine is a policy choice. A choice to prioritize exports over local consumption. A choice to maintain prices over feeding people. A choice to extract resources over sustaining populations. The architects of these policies are never held accountable because they operate within systems that classify their actions as economically rational. The Irish landlord who evicted starving tenants was following the law. The British viceroy who exported grain from famine-stricken India was executing imperial policy. The Soviet official who confiscated Ukrainian grain was fulfilling state quotas. None of them were criminals in the eyes of their governments. They were efficient administrators, loyal servants of the system, and the system rewarded them. Landlords who cleared estates became wealthier. Colonial administrators who maintained revenues were promoted. Soviet officials who met quotas received medals. The famine was someone else's problem. The profit was theirs. This is why famines persist, not because humanity lacks the capacity to feed itself. Global food production has exceeded population needs for decades, but food is not distributed by need. It is distributed by purchasing power. Those who can pay eat, those who cannot pay starve, and those who control the supply profit from scarcity. Markets are efficient at allocating resources to those with money. They are catastrophically inefficient at allocating resources to those without, and when the system prioritizes efficiency over survival, millions die, not because the food is absent, but because the food is somewhere else, priced out of reach or held back to maintain value. The dead are not victims of nature. They're victims of logistics, policy, and profit margins. The famine that kills is almost always a famine that someone, somewhere, benefits from. And as long as the benefits outweigh the political cost of allowing people to starve, the famines will continue. Ireland lost half its population while exporting food. India lost tens of millions while feeding the British Empire. Ukraine was emptied to fuel Soviet industrialization. Ethiopia starved to fund a military regime. And in each case, the food existed. The famine was not a failure of agriculture. It was a success of extraction. This is the brutal arithmetic of famine. Cost is borne by those who cannot resist. Profit flows to those who control the supply. The system that produces this outcome is defended as rational, necessary, and inevitable. The famine that was profitable is the famine that was allowed to happen, and it happens still, in slower, quieter forms, in food deserts, in aid budgets cut for fiscal discipline, in export policies that prioritize foreign markets over local hunger. The mechanisms change. The outcome does not. People starve while food exists. The question is never whether food is available. The question is always who controls it and who profits from its absence.